The courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity as the trial of Officer Mark Daniels began. It was a case that had already caught the attention of the media, the public, and everyone involved in the criminal justice system. Officer Daniels, a man in his late 40s, had been with the police force for over 2 decades. He was a familiar face in the community, someone the people trusted and respected. His reputation as a dedicated cop who had served on the force for so long made this trial all the more unexpected. The accusations against him were serious: misconduct, excessive use of force, and a cover-up that spanned months. As the judge banged his gavel, bringing the courtroom to order, the defense lawyer, Jonathan Price, stood up to make his opening remarks. Jonathan was a black lawyer in his early 30s. He was known for his sharp mind, dedication to justice, and unwavering commitment to truth. Today, as he addressed the court, his usual calm demeanor was slightly masked by the weight of the case. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Jonathan began by outlining the case, explaining that Officer Daniels had been accused of wrongfully using his weapon during a routine traffic stop. The officers involved had claimed it was an act of self-defense, but Jonathan's team had already gathered evidence that suggested otherwise. What was supposed to be a simple traffic stop had turned into a violent confrontation, one where Officer Daniels used excessive force against an unarmed civilian, a teenager named Marcus Washington. Marcus had been stopped for a minor infraction, but the encounter quickly escalated. According to witnesses, Officer Daniels had threatened to shoot Marcus without any clear provocation. As Jonathan spoke, the room remained eerily quiet. He knew the importance of this trial, not just for the victim, Marcus Washington, but for the reputation of the entire police department. If the truth came to light, it could lead to a complete shift in how the public viewed law enforcement, especially in their community. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat, his expression unreadable. He was flanked by his legal team, who seemed confident. His lawyer, a seasoned attorney named James Collins, was no stranger to high-profile cases. He had represented officers in similar cases before, and his strategy was always the same: discredit the accuser, question the motives, and provide an alternative version of events. But this time, things were different. Jonathan wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't just going to let the defense twist the facts, he was going to find the truth, no matter where it led. Jonathan glanced at the jury, noticing that many of them were taking notes. He could tell that they were intrigued, but also unsure of what to make of the accusations. The defense would no doubt paint Officer Daniels as a hero, someone who was simply doing his job, trying to protect himself and others from a potentially dangerous situation. But Jonathan had already seen the cracks in that story. There were too many inconsistencies, too many witnesses who had seen things differently. As the day wore on, Jonathan and his team began presenting their evidence. They called their first witness, a local store owner who had witnessed the traffic stop from a nearby corner. The store owner, a man named David Miller, described the events in chilling detail. He explained how he had been closing his store when he heard the sound of tires screeching. Curiosity had drawn him to the window, where he saw the police car pull over Marcus Washington's vehicle. David watched as Officer Daniels approached Marcus with a stern look on his face. He saw the officer reach for his gun before Marcus had even stepped out of the car. David's testimony was crucial. He had no reason to lie, no personal stake in the matter. He was just a bystander who had seen something that didn't sit right with him. And when David pointed out that Officer Daniels had drawn his weapon without warning, a wave of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. The jury looked at each other, unsure of what to make of this new development. Jonathan could feel the tide shifting in his favor, but he knew there was still a long way to go. The defense would likely try to discredit David's account, calling him a biased observer or even questioning his judgment. But Jonathan was ready for that. He had more witnesses lined up, people who had seen the events unfold in the same way. The truth was beginning to take shape, but it wasn't going to be easy to expose. Later that afternoon, Jonathan decided to take a different approach. He called Marcus Washington to the stand. Marcus, who had been silent up until that point, looked nervous but resolute as he walked to the witness stand. His hands were slightly trembling, and his eyes seemed to dart around the room, but he spoke clearly when he was sworn in. Jonathan asked Marcus to recount what had happened that day, starting with the traffic stop. Marcus's voice cracked as he described how he had been stopped for a minor speeding violation. He explained that he had pulled over quickly when he saw the police lights, but the officer had approached his car with hostility, demanding he get out. Marcus was confused and frightened, but he complied. He had tried to explain that he had made a mistake, but the officer wasn't listening. "It all happened so fast," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even have a chance to talk before he pulled out his gun. I was just trying to tell him what happened, but he kept shouting at me. Then he said he was going to shoot me." The courtroom was silent as Marcus spoke. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the truth. Jonathan could see the jury reacting to the emotional testimony. Some of them were nodding, others seemed shaken. But it wasn't just Marcus's words that were compelling, it was the raw emotion in his voice, the fear that was still evident in his face. Jonathan knew that this was the turning point of the trial. This wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong, it was about a life being threatened for no reason other than an officer's unchecked power. As Marcus finished his testimony, the room was filled with a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. Jonathan could see the wheels turning in the minds of the jurors. They were starting to see the situation differently, starting to understand the gravity of what had occurred. The defense would no doubt try to attack Marcus's credibility, but Jonathan was confident that the truth would prevail. The day came to a close with the judge calling for a recess. As Jonathan packed up his papers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The case wasn't over yet, and there was still much more to uncover. But for the first time in this trial, he felt like they were on the path to the truth. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them head on. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about ensuring that justice was served, for Marcus and for everyone who had been hurt by this tragic incident. The trial continued the following day with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The media had caught wind of the lawyer's impressive start and the shocking testimony from Marcus Washington. But Jonathan knew that the road ahead was still fraught with obstacles. The defense was going to hit back hard, and he needed to be prepared. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with even more onlookers than the day before. The reporters and camera crews were eager to capture every moment, knowing the significance of this case. Officer Daniels sat in his chair, his posture stiff and cold. His expression had not softened since the previous day. He was ready for whatever Jonathan had prepared, but Jonathan could see the uncertainty behind his eyes. The cracks in the officer's defense were becoming visible, and they could no longer be ignored. Jonathan stood up, taking a deep breath before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, we would like to call our next witness." As he made the request, he motioned for his next witness to stand. It was a woman named Emma Lawson, a young woman in her early 20s. Emma had been walking her dog that day and had witnessed the events that had unfolded on the street. She had been one of the first to come forward when she heard about the incident, eager to share what she had seen with the authorities. Emma took the stand, her nervousness evident in the way she fidgeted with the sleeves of her jacket. But when she was sworn in and began to speak, her voice became steady. "I was walking my dog that afternoon," she began, her eyes flicking toward the jury as she spoke. "It was a quiet day. The street wasn't crowded at all. I saw a police car pull over Marcus's vehicle. I didn't think much of it at first. I've seen traffic stops before. But this one was different. The officer was yelling at Marcus right from the start." Emma paused for a moment, as though gathering her thoughts. "At first, I thought maybe Marcus had done something wrong. But then I heard him raise his voice. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I could tell that Marcus was trying to talk, to explain. I could see the officer's hand moving toward his gun, and that's when I knew something was wrong. The room grew still as Emma spoke. She had not been the only one to witness the interaction, but her testimony was particularly powerful because of her clear, unbiased account of the events. She wasn't someone with a personal stake in the matter, someone who was just passing by and happened to be in the right place at the right time. Emma's eyes met Jonathan's as she continued, "I saw Officer Daniels pull out his gun. I didn't understand why. I didn't see Marcus do anything to provoke him. I've seen enough traffic stops to know that this wasn't normal." Jonathan felt a sense of gratitude toward Emma. She had come forward without hesitation, even though she had no obligation to do so. Her words were simple but powerful. Her statement supported Marcus's earlier testimony and further reinforced the idea that Officer Daniels had acted recklessly. After Emma's testimony, the defense lawyer, James Collins, stood up. His face was stern, but there was a hint of frustration in his eyes. He had hoped that the testimonies of Marcus and Emma could be discredited, but now it seemed as though the case against his client was growing stronger. "Your Honor," Collins began, "the witness has provided an account, but her view of the situation is limited. She wasn't close enough to the scene to know the full story. Her testimony is based on what she saw from a distance, and we believe her recollection is not entirely accurate. There are too many variables here that we cannot ignore." Jonathan didn't let the defense's argument faze him. He knew that Collins would try to undermine the witnesses. That was to be expected. But Jonathan had something else up his sleeve. He had carefully prepared for this moment and was ready to counter anything the defense threw his way. "Your Honor," Jonathan replied calmly, "we believe that the testimony of our witnesses has been both clear and compelling. The account provided by Emma Lawson is consistent with Marcus Washington's testimony, and it aligns with the evidence we've presented. This is not a matter of perspective, this is a matter of fact. Officer Daniels acted with excessive force, and our witnesses are simply telling the truth." The judge nodded, signaling that he understood Jonathan's position. But Jonathan knew that the jury was still watching closely, uncertain of where the case would go from here. The defense would continue to paint the officer as a hero who was simply trying to protect himself. They would argue that Marcus had posed a threat, and that the officer had reacted out of instinct. But Jonathan was prepared for that. He wasn't going to let the defense manipulate the narrative. The next few days of the trial were filled with more witnesses and more evidence. Jonathan called to the stand a series of individuals who had also seen the events unfold, each with a unique perspective. One witness was a woman who had been driving down the same street and had seen the traffic stop from her car. Another witness was a nearby neighbor who had overheard the altercation from his porch. Slowly, but surely, the defense's version of events was being chipped away. One of the most significant moments came when Jonathan presented a video recording of the incident. The video had been captured by a nearby store's security cameras, showing the interaction between Officer Daniels and Marcus. It was grainy, but it was clear enough to see the officer's movements. The video confirmed what the witnesses had said: Officer Daniels had drawn his weapon without any immediate threat from Marcus. The defense tried to argue that the video didn't show the full picture. They claimed that the angle was poor and that there were too many shadows. But Jonathan knew that the video was a vital piece of evidence. It wasn't just the video, it was the body language, the way the officer reacted, that told the real story. Officer Daniels had escalated the situation, and he hadn't acted in a way that aligned with proper procedure. As the days went by, Jonathan continued to build his case. He spoke with experts in law enforcement, psychology, and criminal justice, each providing additional context for the events that had taken place. The expert testimonies helped to shed light on the officer's actions, showing that his behavior was not only unjustified but also dangerous. By the end of the week, the jury was beginning to lean toward a conclusion. They were no longer swayed by the defense's arguments. They had seen enough evidence, heard enough testimony, and understood the severity of what had happened. Officer Daniels had been entrusted with the power to protect and serve, but he had used that power recklessly. Jonathan felt a sense of hope, but he also knew that the final verdict was still uncertain. There was still one more thing to do: deliver the closing arguments. As he prepared for the final stages of the trial, Jonathan knew that this case wasn't just about winning in the courtroom. It was about something far more important: making sure that justice was done, for Marcus Washington, for the community, and for everyone who had been impacted by the incident. The trial had reached a critical point. The witnesses had given their testimony, and the evidence was mounting. The public was watching closely, and the pressure on everyone involved was becoming palpable. But nothing could have prepared Jonathan for what was about to happen. The next morning, as the trial was set to resume, a shocking turn of events unfolded, leaving the courtroom in chaos. It was a normal day, or so it seemed. The jury was seated, the judge had entered, and both sides were preparing for the next phase of the trial. Jonathan had just finished speaking with his legal team when he noticed a sudden tension in the air. The defendant, Officer Daniels, was sitting still in his seat, his eyes narrowed, his fists clenched. Jonathan couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something felt off. And then, as the judge called the trial to order, it happened. Without any warning, Officer Daniels stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, causing everyone in the courtroom to turn their attention toward him. For a split second, the room was frozen in shock. No one had expected this kind of outburst. Daniels' face was twisted with anger, and his eyes were wild with emotion. The court staff quickly moved to intervene, but it was too late. With one swift motion, Officer Daniels reached for his gun. The courtroom gasped in disbelief as the officer pointed the weapon directly at Jonathan Price, the defense lawyer who had been uncovering the truth about him. The sudden, violent threat sent a ripple of panic through the room. People screamed and ducked for cover, while others froze in fear. Jonathan's heart raced. His first instinct was to protect himself, but he knew that panicking wouldn't help. He had trained for moments like this, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined that he would be facing an officer in the middle of a courtroom, of all places. He could feel the weight of the gun's barrel trained on him, but somehow, he remained calm. There was no room for fear, he had a job to do. "Everyone, stay calm," the judge shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the chaos. Security rushed into the courtroom, and two officers tackled Daniels to the ground, disarming him in seconds. It was over as quickly as it had started, but the damage had been done. The entire courtroom was in a state of shock. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Jonathan stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind was clear. He hadn't moved an inch, and yet the gun had been pointed at him just moments before. His legs felt weak, but he refused to let fear take hold. This was his moment, the moment he had been preparing for. As the security officers helped restrain Officer Daniels and led him away, Jonathan took a deep breath and straightened his posture. He wasn't going to let this intimidation break him. The judge called for an immediate recess. The jury was escorted out of the room, and reporters flooded the halls, eager to get any information they could about what had just transpired. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. People were in disbelief. How could this happen in a courtroom, of all places? The situation had turned from a legal battle to a life-threatening standoff. Back in the courtroom, Jonathan was escorted to a private room by his legal team. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Officer Daniels had gone too far. The aggression in his eyes had been unmistakable. But what was the officer thinking? Why had he made such a reckless decision in front of everyone? Jonathan had no answers, but he knew one thing for sure: this would change everything. The trial was suspended for the day, and Jonathan knew that they had to regroup. He couldn't let this moment cloud his focus. He had been fighting for justice for Marcus Washington, and that fight wasn't over. Officer Daniels had tried to scare him, but he wasn't about to back down. As Jonathan sat in the room, trying to gather his thoughts, his legal team discussed the implications of what had just happened. There was a long silence before one of his colleagues spoke up. "Jonathan, this could work in our favor. If we present this to the jury, it could show them just how far Officer Daniels is willing to go to protect himself." Jonathan nodded slowly. He could see the point. This act of aggression had exposed the officer's true nature. It wasn't just a case of misconduct anymore, it was a clear demonstration of the officer's inability to control his emotions and his actions. Jonathan knew that they had to make sure the jury understood just how dangerous Daniels had become. The trial resumed the following day, but the atmosphere was different. The tension in the air was thick, and the jurors seemed on edge. They had seen what had happened the day before, and it was clear that the events of that morning had shaken them. But Jonathan wasn't about to let that fear linger. He stood up, walked to the front of the courtroom, and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "yesterday's events were a tragic example of what can happen when power goes unchecked. Officer Daniels pointed a gun at me, a defense lawyer simply doing his job. And why? Because the truth was too much for him to handle. It wasn't enough for him to defend his actions in the courtroom. He had to resort to violence, to intimidation. This is the man we are supposed to trust with our safety." Jonathan paused, letting his words sink in. He could see the jury's eyes glued to him, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and concern. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore, this was about accountability. This was about the system failing to protect those who were supposed to protect the public. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've already seen the evidence. You've heard the witnesses. You've heard from Marcus Washington, from Emma Lawson, from everyone who was there that day. The truth is clear. Officer Daniels acted recklessly, and his behavior has only become more dangerous as the trial has progressed." Jonathan's voice grew stronger as he continued. The events of yesterday weren't just a blip in this trial. They were a direct reflection of the officer's character. He tried to silence the truth with violence, but we won't let that happen. We won't be intimidated. We will hold him accountable, and we will make sure justice is served. The room was silent as Jonathan finished his statement. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. But then the judge spoke, calling for the next phase of the trial to begin. The damage had been done, and the jurors knew what they had to do. They had seen the officer for what he truly was, a man who had used his power to control, intimidate, and now, to threaten someone's life. And that was something they couldn't ignore. The trial would continue, but Officer Daniels had already lost. His actions had sealed his fate. No amount of defense or manipulation could change what had happened. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. The trial had entered its final stage, and the tension was palpable. The events of the previous week had shocked everyone, but the focus had now shifted back to the trial itself. Officer Daniels was no longer just the defendant accused of misconduct, he had become a symbol of the struggle for accountability in law enforcement. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Jonathan prepared to give his closing arguments, knowing that this would be the moment that would decide the fate of the officer, Marcus Washington, and the community that had been affected by the incident. Jonathan had carefully prepared for this moment. He had listened to every piece of testimony, reviewed every piece of evidence, and understood the significance of the case. This wasn't just about one officer's actions, it was about ensuring that the truth was heard, no matter how difficult it was to face. Officer Daniels had tried to intimidate him, but Jonathan had remained strong. He had done his job, and now it was time for the jury to do theirs. The courtroom was packed as Jonathan stood up to give his closing argument. He could feel the weight of the moment on his shoulders. The eyes of the jury, the media, and the public were all on him. But he was determined not to let the pressure affect him. He had a job to do, and he would do it to the best of his ability. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jonathan began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "We are here today because a man was wronged. Marcus Washington, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, was stopped by Officer Daniels for a minor traffic violation. What should have been a routine interaction turned into an ordeal that left Marcus fearing for his life. But it wasn't just Marcus who was hurt. The community was shaken, and the entire system was called into question." Jonathan paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He could see the jury members leaning forward, hanging on to his every word. This was the moment to make his case. "We've heard from the witnesses," Jonathan continued, his eyes sweeping across the jury. "Emma Lawson, who saw the whole thing from a distance. She described how she saw Officer Daniels draw his gun without any provocation. She was a neutral observer, someone with no reason to lie. And then there's Marcus himself, who testified about the fear he felt that day, about how he was treated not as a citizen, but as a threat simply because of who he was." Jonathan let his gaze linger on Officer Daniels, who was sitting quietly, his eyes downcast. The officer had not spoken much during the trial, but his presence spoke volumes. He had tried to defend his actions with the help of his legal team, but it was clear that his words had failed to convince the jury. The facts had spoken for themselves. "Let's not forget the video evidence," Jonathan said, bringing the room's attention back to the video footage that had been presented earlier. It showed Officer Daniels drawing his weapon before Marcus had even gotten out of the car. The defense tried to argue that the video wasn't clear enough, that it didn't show the full picture. But we all know that what we saw was enough to prove that Officer Daniels acted recklessly. He escalated the situation unnecessarily, and that decision could have cost Marcus his life. Jonathan paused again, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The jury was silent, their eyes fixed on him. He could tell they were processing everything he had said, trying to piece together the story from all the different testimonies and pieces of evidence. "This case is not just about one officer's actions," Jonathan continued. "It's about the trust we place in law enforcement. When a police officer acts in the way that Officer Daniels did, he undermines that trust. He betrays the very people he swore to protect. We cannot let this go unchallenged. We cannot allow this behavior to go unchecked." He could feel the momentum building. The jury was with him. He could see it in their expressions. They were starting to understand the bigger picture, the systemic issues that had led to this moment. This wasn't just about a single traffic stop. It was about holding those in power accountable for their actions, no matter who they were. "We have a responsibility," Jonathan said, his voice growing more passionate. "A responsibility to the people who trust us to do the right thing, to ensure that justice is served. Marcus Washington deserves that justice. He deserves to know that he was not just another name on a list of victims, another statistic in a broken system. He deserves to know that his life matters, and that the truth is more important than anything else." The courtroom was still. Even Officer Daniels seemed to be processing Jonathan's words. His expression was unreadable, but his body language had shifted. He seemed smaller now, less certain of his own position. The officer had always been confident, but now there was a sense of doubt in his eyes. He knew that the tide had turned, and the jury knew it too. Jonathan took a deep breath before continuing. "The defense will tell you that Officer Daniels was just doing his job, that he was reacting to a dangerous situation. But we know the truth. We know that he overreacted, that he threatened a young man's life for no reason. And in doing so, he betrayed his duty. He used the power he had been given to intimidate and control, rather than protect and serve." He let that last sentence hang in the air, watching as the jury absorbed it. He could feel the gravity of the situation, the weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just about winning a case. This was about ensuring that the justice system worked for everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice softening, "the truth is in front of you. It's been laid out clearly through the evidence, through the testimony of witnesses, and through the actions of Officer Daniels himself. The question you must ask yourselves is simple: can we afford to let this kind of behavior go unpunished? Can we afford to let a man who threatened the life of another walk free?" Jonathan looked at each member of the jury as he asked the question. He wanted them to understand the weight of their decision. This wasn't just about this one case, it was about sending a message. A message that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. "I trust that you will make the right decision," Jonathan concluded. "I trust that you will uphold the values of justice, fairness, and accountability. The time for excuses is over. The time for action is now." With that, Jonathan sat down, his heart racing. The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick. He had said everything that needed to be said. Now, all he could do was wait for the jury to deliberate and decide the fate of Officer Daniels. As the jury filed out of the courtroom, Jonathan sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The fight wasn't over yet, but he had done everything he could. He had fought for the truth, for Marcus, and for justice. Now, it was up to the jury to decide if they would stand with him. The courtroom was packed when the jury finally returned. Jonathan had been waiting for this moment with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The previous days had been filled with ups and downs, moments of hope and moments of fear. But now, it was out of his hands. The jury had deliberated, and their decision would determine the future not just for Officer Daniels, but for Marcus Washington and the community that had been affected by the entire ordeal. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, the room went completely silent. The tension was thick, and Jonathan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the case hung over him, but he remained calm, focused on what was about to happen. He had done everything he could to ensure that justice was served. He had fought for the truth, and now, it was time to find out if the jury believed him. The judge called the court to order, and the jury foreperson stood up, holding the verdict in his hand. Jonathan's eyes were fixed on him, watching every movement closely. The foreperson cleared his throat, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mark Daniels, guilty of excessive use of force and misconduct," the foreperson read. "We further find that the actions of Officer Daniels were not justified and that his behavior endangered the life of Marcus Washington." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, no one spoke. The courtroom was still, and it was hard to believe that the trial had come to such a dramatic conclusion. Officer Daniels sat motionless in his seat, his face pale. The once confident man who had walked into the courtroom just weeks ago now looked defeated, broken. His eyes were wide, and his lips were trembling. He had not expected this. Jonathan felt a rush of relief flood over him, but he knew there was no time to let his emotions take over. The jury had spoken, and now it was time for the consequences. He had fought for Marcus, and now, justice had been served. The entire room erupted into murmurs and whispers, some in shock, others in approval. It was a bittersweet victory, one that had come at great cost. The judge called for order, and the courtroom fell silent once more. "Officer Daniels," the judge said, his voice steady but stern, "you have been found guilty of serious misconduct. The consequences of your actions cannot be overstated. You will be sentenced at a later date, but for now, you will remain in custody." As the bailiffs moved to escort Officer Daniels from the courtroom, Jonathan turned to look at Marcus. Marcus was sitting in the front row, his expression one of relief and quiet triumph. It had been a long road for him, and he had endured much, but now, he had received justice. His fight was over, and he could finally begin to heal. Marcus's eyes met Jonathan's, and for the first time during the trial, he allowed himself to smile. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough to convey the gratitude and relief he felt. Jonathan nodded in return, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had been on together. It was moments like these that reminded Jonathan why he had chosen this line of work to fight for the truth, to make sure that people like Marcus were not forgotten, that their voices were heard. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Jonathan sat back in his chair, letting the reality of the situation sink in. It had been a difficult battle, one that had tested him in ways he had never anticipated. But the victory was sweet. He had seen the power of truth, the strength of a community coming together, and the importance of holding those in power accountable for their actions. The media descended on the courthouse steps, eager to get statements from Jonathan and Marcus. Cameras flashed, reporters asked questions, but for a moment, Jonathan didn't feel like talking. He needed a moment of peace, a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. He had won the case, but there was still so much work to be done. This trial had been a small part of a much larger issue. The system was broken, and this case, while important, was just the beginning. As Jonathan and Marcus stepped outside, the crowd of reporters swarmed around them. Jonathan held up his hand, signaling for silence. He wasn't interested in giving sound bites or making grand statements. What mattered most was that Marcus had been heard, that the truth had prevailed, and that Officer Daniels would be held accountable for his actions. Today, Jonathan said, his voice clear and steady, we've taken one step toward justice. But this is not the end. This is just the beginning. We will continue to fight for what's right. We will continue to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. The work is not over. But today, we celebrate this victory. The crowd applauded, and Marcus, standing beside him, gave a small nod of appreciation. He had come a long way from the scared young man who had been stopped on that street corner. Today, he was standing tall, knowing that he had been part of something important. As the reporters moved on to other stories, Jonathan and Marcus shared a moment of quiet reflection. Marcus's family had been supportive throughout the entire process, but now, there was a sense of closure. There were still scars from what had happened, but justice had been served. Marcus had been given the chance to speak his truth, and the world had listened. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice soft but sincere. "I don't think I could have made it through this without you. You believed in me when no one else did." Jonathan smiled, his heart full. "It was my honor, Marcus. You did the hard work. You had the courage to stand up for yourself, and that's what made all the difference." As they walked away from the courthouse, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had won the case, but more importantly, he had helped give someone their voice back. This wasn't just about one trial, it was about making sure that every person had the chance to be heard, no matter who they were. The victory was sweet, but Jonathan knew that the fight for justice was far from over. There would be more cases, more challenges, and more battles to face. But for today, he could rest easy knowing that he had made a difference. And tomorrow, he would be ready to continue the fight.